welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and joining me via Skype today is Aaron.
Howdy.
So, a while back, I heard about a game called the Sexy Brutale, and it was an unusual game because it was purported as a game in which you had to solve people's murders using time travel and indirect manipulation of the environment. Now, this was a unique premise in and of itself, but the visuals coupled with a unique soundtrack was something that made me very driven to check it out. And upon checking it out, I found it to be an absolutely unique game and wanted to get other people to try it. And one of those people were Aaron. Now, I suggest a lot of games to Aaron a lot of the time. So, Aaron, why don't you tell me what about this particular game was so interesting to you after I recommended it?
So, I particularly love puzzle games, just in general. And so, a puzzle game where you had manipulation of time just seemed very appealing to me. So, I thought it would be a lot like Braid with the time manipulation to affect the environment. However, much to my surprise and joy, it was very different, just a completely unique game.
And that was something going into it. I was curious about what parallels to other games that it might have, because I really racked my brain about this, and I believe you did too, Aaron. And
yeah,
there were some similarities, to example, for, say, Majora's Mask, but the difference between Majora's Mask and this game is Majora's Mask focused on about as huge of a scale as you could. You were preventing the moon from crashing into the world. And in here, you could be manipulating things as small as, like, changing a bullet casing out.
Yeah, and so it's just a very detailed game when it comes to interacting with the environment and finding the things you need to find.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that, speaking of the details, it was fascinating replaying the game, because I know you kind of saw it twice in rapid succession due to circumstance on your part. It's interesting seeing all the foreshadowing and all the little details that they put in there ahead of time that don't really jump out at you on your first play.
No, they did a nice little way to work everything in, especially with how the game ended. But I'm sure we'll touch on that in a bit. But just to really make unique characters and have their environment around them almost be representative of them.
I would agree with that sentiment. And another game, just to get the parallels in there, I checked out a game called Ghost Trick, in which you play as a character who tries to prevent people's deaths through manipulation of the environment. However, in the Sexy Brutale, what that game focuses more on is you trying to get a understanding of the environment from having absolutely no information, and using that understanding of both the murder that you have to glean through successive iterations to figure out what small details need to change and how you need to get there. Whereas in Ghost Trick, you get the entire murder up front, and you have to figure out, basically, in Ghost Trick, how to manipulate the Rube Goldberg machine of the murder situation. What small lever you have to change, metaphorically, to stop that person from dying. It's a much more frantic approach to the Sexy Brutale, which is interesting because, given the premise, you would think there could be a lot of really high-tension circumstances, but you don't get a lot of that.
Well, I think a lot of that comes from just the fact that you can manipulate time. If you miss your opportunity, you can just reset the clock, right? And each day in the game is quite short, and so even screwing something up and having to start over isn't going back 2 hours of gameplay or something.
Absolutely. That is a valid point, is this game doesn't really have a fail state as we see defined in most other games, because even in the worst case scenario, quote unquote, you just get to the end of the day without resetting it, which automatically causes the day to reset.
Yeah, so it's not like Majora's Mask where the moon crashes in and suddenly you get a game over.
Yeah, you get a big violent cutscene where the residents of the town get crushed by this moon and there's fire everywhere. Nothing like that in the Sexy Brutale. Just some suspicious rain right beforehand. But anyways, I wanted to talk about what this game did well, because this was not the... I think this was the first developmental foray by Tequila Works, the people who put it out. And I know that it wasn't the first game published by the people who created it, but I thought it was interesting that this was the inaugural run from somebody, because it was a very ambitious game for a first game.
Well, it was a very stylized game, and so I think it was to make a mark and to... It seems almost defining for a producer, not necessarily overreaching.
I would 100% agree with that. So I want to touch on the different things that this game did well, interesting design decisions they made, and we're not going to break it down specifically by the murders themselves, because we could do a expanded walkthrough of this game, but you can find that anywhere. I want to touch on the design decisions that this game made to really set itself out, because as a new game development, they want to make sure that they put something out there that's not only accessible, but easily accessible. And to do that, you really have to tighten your design up. And I saw a lot of that in this game, and I'd like to talk about that.
All right.
So the first murder, it was very solid because it drops you in with absolutely no context. You get a brief introduction from a phantom, but this murder was different from all the other ones in that every time it was a much shorter murder, which worked well to the tutorial aspect, but it did touch on the basics at a very high level of everything you need to do to solve a murder. For example, you need to identify who is dying, which, if there was one downside, if this was the only murder where you didn't get a little card that said, this is the person who you're saving, here's their name. Every other murder did that. But this one introduced that you needed to find who was dying, find out how they were dying, and then when it brought you back afterwards, because the first few times you couldn't, but then it also brought you back where the murderer was, so you could see the murderer, you could see what they were using to murder, and it prompted you to, hey, by the way, there's only one thing in this room you can investigate. Maybe you should investigate it. And it also brought up the concept of you have to run away anytime anybody's in the room, be they friend or foe, and it doesn't negatively affect you in any way.
And that's kind of an interesting thing, is that you can also move through the room when you are suddenly discovered. You have to leave before you can interact with anything, but you are certainly allowed to go out through a different door, say. Is interesting. It's not like it just suddenly kicks you back, or the door is locked, you can't go in.
Now it's interesting, did you, whenever a friend or foe comes into a room, everybody's wearing masks in this game. The setting of this game is a casino mansion murder mystery is basically what this is. It's a masquerade ball. Everybody's wearing masks, which succeed very well in dehumanizing all the characters. And every time you go into a room, the masks will levitate off of them and start attacking you, for a lack of a better term. And that was disconcerting the first time I ever saw it. But did you ever actually, quote-unquote, die because of that?
No, there were multiple... So the first couple of times it happened, yeah, you think your controller starts shaking, the room goes red, it starts playing scary music, it's pretty much every sign of you are going to die. But then it just... if the mask reaches you, it just kind of shakes your controller a little bit more and you see your character freak out. But he can still walk, which is all you really need to do.
I'm curious what happens when your life bar does run out, because in subsequent playthroughs, because at this point I've played the game 3 times, I got a lot more aggressive with running through rooms that had people in them. And my life bar at points did get low, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm curious what does happen when you run that out.
I cannot say either way. I really didn't even notice the life bar when I played through it, and only caught it when I watched someone else play through.
Anyways, once you do go through the steps necessary to save this first person, they give you some more information at this point. That includes the fact that what's interesting is these characters, they don't need you to hold their hand entirely to save them. These are very capable characters that you're trying to save. They were just completely unaware that they were attempting to be murdered, which does play into the plot at large later in the game. At the end of this, they open up your time constraints and your location constraints, and though this is a technique used in a lot of different media, I like the fact that the first mission, while being very short, also served as a cold open to the game, because after you finish it, you wake up in somewhere entirely different. You get a snide little comment by the help who's wandering by on a different level of the first room, and then boom, the Sexy Brutale. And that's how it drops you in.
Yeah, it was it was a very short tutorial, so it's not like you're trying to learn every little bit, and then it's just pretty quick into the actual game and letting you explore, which seems to be the main goal of the game, or the main beauty of the game.
Absolutely. And as the game progressed, as we'll now discuss, they made sure to introduce small little details into each one that you could relatively organically pick up on. So one thing that kills me in a lot of games nowadays is they're dead set on holding your hand, putting everything on screen, and to me that is a bad design, because that takes you really out of the moment when you have to read a lot of expositionary text that tells you everything that has to be done. That's frustrating to me. So.
Yeah, well, just the design of the game is pretty simplistic. It's just supposed to be focusing on the surroundings, not necessarily what the character has available to them.
Correct. And the second murder did more of reinforcing than anything, because in this second murder, you had to make sure you did know every detail that was involved in the murder. Now, it may not have been so important to know all the specifics, but you had to make sure you knew first who, as established in the first tutorial, you had to make sure you knew who exactly was dying, and you had to know where they were going, because that had a couple murder victims, which was another thing they introduced at this point, was that sometimes you might have to save more people, and you had to understand the dynamic that went in between those two, which I also thought was unique, because it made it so you didn't just have to focus on preventing one death. You had to find the cause and effect between multiple different ways people were dying and figure out what was the push-off point for those.
I actually kind of have to disagree for that, just because I never saw the second victim of the first real murder in the game. And so by trying to explore and watch one of the other victims who was separated, I was able to complete the objective and explore or discover what needed to happen without ever seeing the second victim.
And that was on the first playthrough, and here is something that it kind of bothered me, but I was trying to focus on this in a positive, constructive way, was the first time we did it, we did actually complete this murder without knowing how we completed it. We just kind of wandered around and clicked random buttons. For example, in this one, they indicate to you, by being aware of the murderer, he makes it very obvious that there are some cameras he has turned off. But if you don't do a lot of searching because you're still trying to figure out the world, you might just note, he said he turned a camera off. To me, that says I need to turn that camera on, without communicating why exactly you need to turn that camera on. What we ended up doing the first time we played is I'm like, I'm going to go turn that camera on. And once the camera was turned on, I just went into different rooms and diddled around, and suddenly the other murder victim that you have to make aware is like, oh my god, somebody's dying. I'm going to save them. I was not... They were a little loose in those parameters, so I didn't actually go through the way they intended for me to go through, but that's what they were trying to communicate.
I mean, I did basically the exact same thing, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because once you complete that and you get a greater understanding of what is happening within the house, you know more about where characters are, where villains and victims are, and that lets you explore the house in a more focused manner.
Absolutely.
And so at that point, I would consider it even more of just the next step in exploring. The first of the two victims is easier to find, and so you're still getting used to the game, you're still learning how to interact with environments, and so by having that, not necessarily needing to know everything right out the gate, certainly saves some headaches.
It does, and I'm glad you brought this up, the fact that the first of the murder victims is easier to find. It does highlight the fact that the murder victims very usually have a connected dynamic, which is to say, if you have trouble figuring out what exactly you're trying to accomplish, if you continue to shadow one of them, they'll usually give you a strong indication of what the trade-off for the other one is, which helped establish strong character relations. And that was very important in knowing how to continue, I guess. But anyways, after that second murder that established the back and forth dynamics, they kind of touch upon this slightly for the following one, because this one introduced a lot of murder after that, introduced a lot of interesting ideas as well, which is to say you only had to save one person, but that person was motivated entirely for altruistic reasons. So you had to shadow the character the entire time that they were running around, because this introduced the idea that sometimes a character will give you insight into a new location that you would not have been aware beforehand.
Yeah, so just spying on people gives you so much more information than trying to explore.
And in addition to that, other than seeing the fact that you couldn't just run around and click everything, because without seeing somebody, you wouldn't have known what things to click. And they do give you some idea that you have to spy on them tremendously, because I think a couple characters call out the fact that there are blank spots in the map where there should be rooms, but there are not rooms. And this was the first murder, and I thought this was, again, a really unique idea. You have to let the person die in order to solve their murder.
Yeah, so that was kind of an issue for me, is because I assumed once the character was dead, basically game over, there's nothing else you can do, and I'd reset the time too quickly, just because there's no penalty for resetting time, and I wanted another opportunity to try and beat the game. But without divulging too much, or trying not to divulge too much, the key to saving a person happens after they die. And so that was something I think incredibly unique to the game.
It was. And because previously, upon discussion off the record of this, I thought that you didn't have to let anybody die in this game if you knew it was happening. But much like the investigation, you had to watch somebody die in order to get a certain thing that allowed you to continue on. And that gave you a really good indication. This was done in the lowest stakes way possible. There was only one person you needed to save. There was one thing you needed when they die. It was pretty much the introduction of the idea in the most basic way possible to make sure that you had the concept.
Yeah.
And after you figure out both what you needed to discover upon their death, and once you'd done the peeping, it gave you a very thorough idea of, in the future, hey, this might be something that I need to remember. So the game did a lot of good iterative building, because after you discovered that information that allowed you to solve that third murder, the fourth murder kind of just built on everything in front of it like a good game would. It showed the fact that the murderer had to be shadowed and had to be understood in order to solve it. And you've touched upon this before. I think that this one was actually your favorite because this was the most logical murder to you, I believe.
Yeah, it really was. And so just through exploring the rooms and understanding how the people moved lets you really control or affect how everything plays out. And so I just thought it was a real clever technique.
And I thought it was clever the first time because this is one of those murders in which you don't actually have to watch the person die. You can do it on the first time if you want, but if you're not randomly guessing luckily, you definitely wouldn't get this on the first go. And what allows you, the information that allows you to solve this murder was something I personally found very interesting because you have to figure out that the antagonist in this murder, the murderer, is not a fan of certain sounds, and the first time through you wouldn't notice that. So,
well, if you were watching him, you would, but at that point,
it's too late.
Yeah, once you find out certain information, then it's too late, and you have to start over. But that's the whole point of the game. That said, you also have to continue to explore the house to figure out how exactly to use that information.
And this
in the best manner. But
absolutely. And this murder was interesting because you'd actually much earlier in the game found this character's body, but you had zero context as how the body got where it was. Now, you had some insight because it says this person died horrifically this way, but you had zero context. This game provides you with that context, which also plays into the fact that all of these murders are technically happening simultaneously. You're just siloing who you're going to save at a certain point, which was kind of a little frustrating to me the first time through just because I hadn't beaten it. And once you beat it, they provide a healthy conclusion for that. But
yeah.
This was the first time, if memory serves, that they actually flesh out a event that you haven't seen elsewhere in a way that lets you actually get an idea of things that are going on in other parts of the house. And on top of that,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think I actually interacted with the body before the third murder.
I remembered I had because in the part of scoping everything out, for the first time, for one of the earlier murders, I saw thump, 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 this character falls down a trash chute. Like, what in the world is that? This character's body is covered in all these terrible gashes. Huh. And this...
Well, then.
Yeah, it was real dark. This game managed to get a T rating, though, because most of the violence is done textually, which isn't to say you don't see people die, but there's very little blood. In fact, one of the characters who is denoted as the Bloody Woman, I really thought that she was just covered in red. I didn't actually see it as being... She's supposed to have a character model of, like, you can see her musculature, and her bright red coloration is supposed to be blood, but it's so bright it looks more like she's a lava girl. So...
Yeah, I thought that's just kind of her dress becoming liquid. So
yeah. The concept art is very Tim Burton-esque. But this murder was actually the first time that they explicitly touch on the fact that your main character has some kind of trauma in their past. And this is the first, well, not the first explicit time it's brought up, but it starts hinting at the fact that there's something else tied very strongly into your character that they're going to touch upon most of. The next murder I had the most notes about because you have to know both the victim and the murderer's path, because at the beginning of this particular murder, the only thing you have is the fact that, because you're in a new isolated area, the only thing you have is the victims. And the murderers aren't even present on the map at this point. So getting an initial recon, if what you had previously been doing is just doing a recon of the whole area, you actually have to have an understanding better of where the characters are coming from and their exact actions. And this part, I believe, this other idea that was introduced was frustrating to you, because in this murder, they introduced the idea of items that don't disappear when you rewind time. Because prior to this, every item, with the exception of the one you used to sync up with checkpoints, disappeared every time you rewound time.
Correct. And so I just assumed that the new permanent item that you picked up was again temporary and probably just for this one scenario. However, that was not the case. And so I spent quite a bit of time into trying to find an item I already had. So that was interesting. Although the game itself does make a pretty clear point of when you lose items by restarting time, and that did not occur, obviously, for the new item that stuck around. However, since you reset time so often, and it's just almost become second nature, because I think the days last 12 minutes.
Yeah, 12.
In the game. So when I reset it that first time with the new item, I didn't necessarily think to watch the item disappear. I was just resetting time and kind of on autopilot. And so I don't think many people would run into that particular difficulty.
I would agree with that. And this is another example of where you have to kind of get past the point of no return in order to have the information necessary to prevent this murder. Because every time you prevent a murder, not every time, but most of the time, they give you some new skill that allows you to progress in the game. And at this point, you're able to see these various NPCs as long as you activate a certain item. And earlier in the game, they see the character with which has this skill. They activate items multiple times before they interact with these NPCs. And the item you get allows you to activate said item, but the information that the NPC would give you is useless after the point which you would normally get the item. So this is an interesting case because you don't have to let them die, but you do have to rewind because a non-linear approach to the events is required in order to actually wrap this up.
Yeah, so the only way to get enough information is to let so much time pass that you can't stop the murder, at least.
Mm-hmm. And another interesting point is that though this was over halfway through the game, this is the first time that they formally introduce you to the overarching antagonist of this game, which you had seen in bits and pieces prior to this, but it was fascinating that it took them this long to officially go, yeah, this is the person who is trying to be against you, and that I just thought that was interesting.
Well, you know where all the quote-unquote bad guys are, and so I didn't necessarily miss the presence of a big bad up to this point. Not necessarily, because you had a clear objective of save people, and you knew who was doing it just because you could see all the bad guys running around. I personally did not miss not having the big bad show up until this point.
It wasn't a narrative bit that I necessarily missed. It's just you often see a antagonistic role motivating the story forward. So it was kind of strange that at this point in the game they decided to explicitly introduce that antagonistic element. So that was just something that did jump out at me.
Whereas I would think that's just part of the mystery. So in the beginning, you don't know why anything's going on and you're trying to figure it out. And then introducing the big bad halfway through almost just adds to it. You know, you're not trying to figure out who they are from the beginning. You're just trying to stop murders. And then big bad shows up and suddenly you have a new question to solve, which I thought was nice.
Yeah, all right. I would grant you that. But after you wrap up that particular murder and get another set of abilities, you go on to the last explicit murder of the game. And this one, to me, was the culmination of all the skills that you had gathered up until this point, because it required you to save multiple people, which you saved just as many couples as you did not couples in this game. That is something, if they do create a Sexy Brutale 2, which God knows how they would do that with the way this game ends. I would like to see them making so you have to save like 3 people at once, or maybe even more. I would love to see the level of complexity in these murder mysteries go up significantly, because that makes it a more difficult puzzle, and you said it yourself, puzzles are great.
They are the driving force for the game, and so the more powers, the more people, the more moving parts just makes things more interesting.
Correct. So that's what made this murder super interesting to me, is because you had to shadow the victims across the entire house, which you now essentially had access to. You had to figure out where the victims, they have a plan they're trying to execute for reasons you're not fully aware of. You have to figure out where this plan messes up. And at the point of failure, that's where you have to identify the murderer and see what that murderer did to change things, because he changed multiple things that unless you were super fast, you wouldn't be able to figure out what they were changing, because both of the victims are very vocal. So they'll both be talking to a lot of characters and interacting with a lot of NPCs, so you really have to keep track of everything that's going on in this murder. And I found that to be fascinating.
Yeah, just getting back to the moving parts, is this had the most moving parts to follow, most things to interact with, which made it much more difficult. Having 2 characters basically walk in opposite directions and needing to follow them both for quite a long amount of time for the day was just a nice culmination of the game up to that point.
I would agree with that. And one of them gave a very strong focus onto what the narrative of the murders would be, and the other one had the mechanical implications of it. And both of them incorporated ideas that you had seen throughout the game. For example, to get some crucial information progressing with the mechanical portion, you have to utilize the idea that strong sounds will override quieter sounds. So if you don't get to an area before the NPC does, you can't hear some information that's crucial for you to getting further in the game. So I just liked how every little detail seemed to come together for this particular murder, and it made it, to me, my favorite murder mystery of the entire game.
I could see that. The amount of exploration and following of characters really seemed to greatly increase for this murder. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was just a nice way to almost signify that you're getting to the end of the game. That, because I honestly thought that this would be the last one of the game, and I thought it was building to the finale of you would save them, Big Bad would show up, and you basically get your dialogue ending, which was not the case, but that's almost what this last puzzle seemed like.
And in your defense, the display screen does make it seem like this would be the final murder. I don't think they show the portrait of the actual final murder at that point. I could be wrong.
They do not.
So, after you solve this murder, I'm not going to say the game goes off the rails, but if the game does have a definite weakness, it's the fact that they definitely load the end with the majority of the narrative, because prior to the end game area, they'd given you some oblique indications of what actually happened, and when you are in this quote-unquote end game, they give you a lot of metaphorical displays of what got you to the situation you're in. You have to solve several puzzles, one of which requires you to explicitly use the turning back time in order to solve it. It requires you in a very specific location in order to get what you're looking for. You have to turn it back multiple times so the item there can come to completion, which very strongly alludes to what's going on in the house. You also have to solve another puzzle in which a lot of different machines are manipulated in a certain order and it gives you some indications to how the NPCs, the murderers, MO is happening. And I'm trying to think, there was a third puzzle. Oh, there was a third puzzle in which an understanding of a previous murder had to be exploited in order to flip a switch, and there's a very large mausoleum-ish puzzle that happens that's a very out of place. Things get spatially weird in the basement.
So I'd been thinking about this, and I was trying to justify it being almost like the end of a murder mystery show during the big reveal, where if there had been clues throughout the game, it wouldn't have seemed like such a breakneck change in the pacing and the storytelling of the game, and you could think back and try and find different clues as to what was happening. But that really didn't seem to be the case. And so I understand they have to tell the story at some point, but like you said, it was very backloaded, where all of a sudden they had quite a bit of story to tell and not a lot of game to do it in.
And that was what was strange with the pacing there at the end, is because they more formally introduce you to the bad guy. They also give you a bunch of metaphorical puzzles that very, very strongly relate to the actual backstory that they continue expounding upon here. And after the formal introduction of both the bad guy and what exactly is up with the time rewinding mechanic, because it's a very fantastic game. A lot of people, because they're playing a game, they won't question the fact that it weirdly rains right before time goes backwards, or, heck, time goes backwards at all. That's not how time goes.
It's just a game, and so you kind of go with, what is it called? Suspend reality for a bit.
Yes,
and just kind of go, there we go. And so you just kind of go with that. I wonder if it didn't seem so rushed at the end. If you could take a little bit more time with that last murder, with the last real puzzle to solve, if it wouldn't have seemed so breakneck. If they could put clues a little bit longer throughout. But I understand that they were trying to use that final puzzle to try and build suspense or build up the tension of the game.
And they were trying to both build up the tension, and they were trying to use some pretty, I don't want to say heavy-handed, but some pretty significant metaphorical puzzles to get across some ideas that they would then expound upon explicitly shortly thereafter. But this seems like it would have been a good opportunity to have the game indicate, hey, maybe you should go back to these people who, because of the way the game's set up, they're still technically dying on every consistent iteration. But if there would have been a way that they say, hey, maybe you need to go get this thing from this person you saved before, like, this would have been a good opportunity for the game to tie back into those characters in a way that directly interacted with them, instead of a way that had a bunch of puzzles disconnected from those characters.
Yeah, that would have been real nice, just a way to see how each character really ties in to the main character.
Mm-hmm.
Oh well, missed opportunity.
Well, and again, this was their initial effort foray, so I think they nailed it pretty strong for this being an initial go, but after you finish all these puzzles in the basement, you are given, basically they point you and say, you need to go to the end game. And if there was one point where you had very, very little direction, it was after you're done with the basement, they drop you back in the main mansion. And to the best of my knowledge, don't give much of an indication where you're supposed to go from there, which is a little, yeah, they don't really tell you where to go, which was frustrating.
I could see that.
But there's nowhere else left to go.
Well, yeah, in my exploration of the house, or of just in the game itself, I had already discovered the area you were supposed to go, but since nothing had happened in that area before that point, I just kind of assumed that's how everything was supposed to play out, because it was the one area that hadn't been utilized yet.
And it makes sense, and this final area that they send you to, it gives you much more explicit ideas of what the actual backstory is. And it does do a thing that I thought was really interesting, because we talked about how the game had good design and that it gave you small gameplay mechanics that they then built on in subsequent missions. And they introduce an idea here that you have to creatively use the clocks in order to get past certain obstacles, because comparatively speaking, you have to go from the 0 meter mark to the 100 meter mark, but when you get to the 100 meter mark, there's a door and a clock, and the door has been closed. And your observation is, if only you had been there earlier, you could have gotten through the door. So the idea that they're trying to communicate is, instead of just using these clocks as checkpoints at this point, actually use them so you can be at different places at different times. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it's no longer saving you the hassle of to transport you. They are there as a real function of the game.
Yes. And as you get through this penultimate area, it introduces you to the character you didn't know you were trying to save, which is the puzzle associated with it. It's very short but sweet, and it is very motivated by the player character's personal reasons and the helpers. And this is where they start bringing back a whole bunch of everything they've been alluding to in this game. Now, how well that comes together is a different story, but...
Yeah, I mean, I know what they were trying to get at and how they were trying to tell their story, but again, it just seemed so rushed at the end and so just jammed in there.
It got real aggressive, and without spoiling anything, because we've done very good at not spoiling much, it was almost shocking, the introduction, that there were significantly less NPCs than you thought there were.
That's a good way to...
Yeah. And they try near the end to, and this is where the game definitely fell flat. The antagonist gave his reasons for doing all the murdering, giving the indication of why this stuff should happen, and he tries to make it so it's not entirely sociopathic. He tries to make it a redemption story, and it does manage to be mildly emotional, if kind of strange in the execution. It's definitely the weakest of all the murders that you're solving, but it's not intended to be strong. It's intended to kind of give emotional closure to the story that, and this is where it was weird, they didn't really introduce the emotional aspect of the story until after the last true murder, which was where it got kind of strange.
Well, because all of that is exposition. And so at that point, they're basically telling all of their story in 20 minutes of a 3-hour game. And so it's just very, because you are no longer playing through a murder scenario and finding the information organically, it almost seems just forced upon you, because it's forced upon you in a few cutscenes, a few text scrolls. And so that to me just seemed, for lack of a better word, forced.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But and this is why, without again spoiling it, it does all tie together very well at the end, but I have no idea how they do a second one.
I don't think there's even a chance. They might find they might take the same basic idea and apply it to completely new characters, but
it'd have to be the concept only.
Yeah.
The end of the game aside, this game really, really spoke to me. This is why I've been very passionate about trying to get other people to play it, because it uses an art style that you don't see attempted for a lot of games, because it's decently a chibi. Like, it's a very cutesy art style, sort of, but it tries to tell a story that goes away from the cutesy. It tries to have an execution that's not on the cutesy. And it uses because of the Murder Mansion casino thing going on, the soundtrack is also a very unique electro swing type thing. And the gameplay is almost entirely atypical. So combine all those things together, and you have a game that's very, very well put together.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed just the art styles. Each section of the house, I mean, the entire game takes place in a mansion, so it doesn't get completely wild, but each section of the house felt unique, felt like an individual area to explore. And like you said, the gameplay is just so different, so unique compared to anything else that there's no comparison for it.
I would 100% agree with that, and God knows we've tried to find those comparisons. So
yeah, it's been quite a while.
So I know that this game has gotten more and more exposure. It came out originally on, I believe, PS4, Xbox One, and probably PC. They have since ported it to the Switch, where I'm hoping it got additional exposure because, man, the Switch is the hot thing to be on right now. So I'm hoping
it seems like a good game for the Switch.
Yeah.
The graphics are mild. It's not a long game, and you can kind of pick it up and put it down. And so, to me, it seems built for something like the Switch.
I would agree with that. So I'm curious, though I can't think of an easy way to find these numbers. I'm curious to see what a breakdown of how it did on all the systems was. And one thing that I found this interesting, the developer sent out a tweet at one point that said that the name The Sexy Brutale was a bit divisive in the community, and they weren't 100% sure why. Now, Aaron, you want to give, when you tried to look this game up, I think this is a good idea of why it might have been a little divisive when you tried to do some investigation about it.
I did not realize you could get adult titles on the PlayStation Network, so that was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, so that was it's what I responded to their communication with was, well, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily an inherently bad title. It just has parallels to other things that maybe if you're trying to get a 16-year-old to buy your game and they don't realize how it's spelled when their parents see adult content being pulled up, that might be off-putting to both the parent and the child. So
why are you searching for this?
Yeah.
What is on your PlayStation? Yeah, I could see that.
I just thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was a thing.
Do.
Yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with their title. It has to do with other content available.
Right. I just thought that was a humorous aside. But that being said, Aaron, are there any final thoughts you would like to talk about this particular game?
Nope, just telling people to go buy the game. It is completely worth it.
Absolutely. It may not necessarily have a ton of replay value. There is actually an alternate ending that gets into another metaphorical concept behind the story, that it was a lot stronger the second time I played the ideas that were trying to be communicated with the alternate ending. However, one thing that I know they could have done better, you suffered from this, was they don't give you a good way to keep track of the MacGuffins you need to collect.
Yeah.
So
no one wants to be in the 199 Pigeon Club. And so just an ability to track what you've done is always appreciated.
I would give you that. And another thing that, and this is just mild nitpicks, given the way the story was communicated, it was a little difficult to give a lot of backstory to the characters, and the way that you glean that, it could have used some improvement, because you can get backstory for the characters via like finding their invitations, but finding their invitations is a puzzle in and of itself. So, but there wasn't a particularly organic way to communicate this information another way. So this is nitpicking without an actual solution in mind. So I'm not going to raise it as an actual valid criticism.
No, I wouldn't say that. Again, I think most of the issues, at least for the storytelling, are a result of it trying to keep it a mystery, trying to keep you guessing. And so the opportunity for just straight exposition is difficult to come by.
I would 100% agree with that. But all that being said, I would 100% agree with Aaron, and that this is a game you should definitely check out. It goes on sale a fair bit, so if you have the ability to cut out about, the first time I played through it took me about 8-ish hours. Subsequent playthroughs, once you know what you're doing, it goes much faster. But I would 100%, if you have the time, if you have the money, give this game a look-see and let us know what you think. If you've already played this game, Tell us, what did we miss about the good and the bad that we should have brought up? Was this game not even worth the time for you? If so, why was it not worth the time? But, Aaron, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Jump online and tell us what you thought about this. But until next time, my name is Josh, and this is Co-Opinions.